For hundreds of thousands of years, humans moved through the world instead of settling inside it. They followed migrating animals, gathered wild plants, fished rivers and coastlines. When conditions changed, they moved with them. Then, after the last ice age, something unusual began happening in a handful of places. People stayed, not everywhere, not all at once, but often enough that the pattern began to matter. They returned to the same ground, built more permanent shelters, stored food for seasons that had not yet arrived, invested labor in places they once would have left behind. At first glance, this seems like obvious progress, yet some of the earliest farming communities worked harder than many of the hunter gatherers who came before them. Their diets often became narrower. Their settlements brought people closer to disease, waste, conflict, and famine. And still, the change spread. Long before fully developed agriculture, people in what is now Jordan were already making bread like food from wild grains. In the Levant, some communities began living more settled lives before farming had fully emerged. At Göbekli Tepe, enormous stone structures appeared before the rise of the civilizations most people associate with monuments and cities. Later sites such as Çatalhöyük revealed generations of people living, building, remembering, and burying their dead in the same place for centuries. Something was pulling humanity toward a new way of life, a life of fields, storage pits, houses, animals, boundaries, obligations, and plans for a future that no one could guarantee. Why did humans choose it? Why did it spread so widely? And once it began, why did it become so difficult to abandon? Today, we trace the long path from mobile hunter gatherers to settled communities and uncover how humans moved from wild landscapes into permanent worlds of grain, animals, memory, and rules, creating a civilization that would reshape the planet and every generation that followed. If you enjoy these long journeys through history and science, a like and subscribe really helps the channel. And let me know in the comments, how did you discover this channel? Let's begin. Long before walls, granaries, and permanent villages appeared on the landscape, human beings had already become remarkably skilled at living in the world around them. The deep past was not an age of waiting, nor a long pause before progress arrived. It was a time shaped by knowledge accumulated across countless generations, carried not in books or monuments, but in memory, observation, and practice. Daily life moved with the rhythms of land and season. People hunted animals across grasslands and forests. They fished in rivers, lakes, and coastal waters. They gathered fruits, seeds, nuts, tubers, and edible plants wherever they appeared. Along shorelines, shellfish could provide reliable meals. Honey offered concentrated sweetness. Each season presented different opportunities, and survival depended on knowing where those opportunities would emerge. This way of life demanded far more than simple endurance. Fire was carefully controlled and used for warmth, cooking, protection, and landscape management. Stone, bone, wood, and other materials were shaped into tools suited for particular tasks. Animal tracks became stories written across soil and mud. Subtle changes in weather, vegetation, and migration patterns revealed information about the months ahead. Knowledge of the environment was detailed, practical, and often astonishingly precise. Across surprisingly large distances, materials moved between groups. Stone from one region could appear far from its geological source. Shells, pigments, and crafted objects sometimes traveled beyond the places where they originated. These exchanges connected communities through networks that stretched across landscapes. In some cultures, the dead were buried with care, suggesting enduring bonds between memory and place. Art appeared on cave walls, carved surfaces, ornaments, and symbolic objects, revealing minds already engaged with meaning, identity, and imagination. Mobility itself was one of humanity's greatest advantages. Movement reduced dependence on any single food source. If resources declined in one area, another location could offer abundance. Refuse and waste did not accumulate around a permanent home year after year. Possessions remained relatively few, encouraging flexibility rather than attachment. Opportunity could be followed wherever it appeared, whether in migrating herds, seasonal harvests, or productive fishing grounds. For thousands of years, this strategy proved extraordinarily successful. Humans spread across continents, adapted to diverse environments, and survived dramatic environmental changes without farms, cities, or states. The ability to move was not a weakness awaiting correction. It was a powerful solution to the uncertainties of the natural world. Gradually, however, the climate itself began to shift. As the last ice age faded, many regions experienced warmer and more stable conditions. Certain plants and animals became more predictable from one year to the next. In parts of Southwest Asia, dense stands of wild cereals appeared alongside rich populations of game. These landscapes offered unusual concentrations of food, season after season. Within such places, a subtle change began to take shape. The story does not begin with a farmer planting a field. It begins with people who stopped leaving. A fragment of ancient bread changes the shape of the story. Buried beneath layers of time at Shubaika 1 in northeastern Jordan, archaeologists uncovered traces of bread like food dating to roughly 14,400 years ago. The date arrives quietly, yet it carries enormous weight. These remains belong to a world that existed thousands of years before fully established agriculture appeared across Southwest Asia. Long before fields stretched across valleys and hillsides, people were already transforming wild grains into something recognizable, something prepared, something made. The discovery unsettles a familiar image of the past. Civilization often seems to begin with farming, as though crops suddenly emerged and drew humanity into a new way of life. Yet the evidence suggests a slower and more intimate relationship. Grain was not an unfamiliar resource waiting to be noticed. People already understood it. They knew where it grew, when it ripened, and how it behaved across the seasons. Gathering wild grain demanded patience and attention. Stands of edible grasses did not present themselves everywhere. They appeared in particular places and at particular times. Reaching them required movement, planning, and knowledge accumulated through repeated observation. Once found, the seed heads had to be collected before wind, animals, or weather scattered them back across the landscape. The work continued after the harvest. Stalks needed processing. Seeds had to be separated from husks. Stone tools reduced kernels into coarse flour through countless repetitive motions. Water was added. Fire was managed. Heat transformed a loose collection of ingredients into food that looked and tasted different from the plants that produced it. Each stage required effort. None happened by accident. Seen from a distance, a piece of ancient bread appears simple. Seen more closely, it represents a chain of decisions extending far beyond a single meal. The people who produced it were investing time and labor into a resource that demanded preparation. They were not merely consuming what nature offered in its raw form, they were reshaping it through skill. Something subtle was taking place within these routines. Wild grains were becoming woven into daily life. Certain patches of land gained importance because useful plants returned there year after year. Familiar harvesting locations became destinations worth remembering. The cycle repeated. Seasons arrived, seeds ripened, and attention returned to the same landscapes once more. In this way, grain began influencing human behavior long before domestication transformed the plant itself. The relationship was already forming, not yet a field, not yet a harvest measured in surplus, but something quieter. Human schedules were beginning to bend around recurring opportunities hidden in the natural world. The fragment from Shubaika 1 preserves more than food. It preserves evidence of a growing partnership between people and place. By the time agriculture eventually emerged, many of the necessary skills already existed. Gathering, grinding, mixing, cooking, and valuing grain were not new inventions. They were familiar practices refined across generations. Once wild seeds could be turned into dependable food, the landscape itself began to offer reasons to remain nearby a little longer than before. Across parts of the Levant, a quiet experiment was already unfolding long before the familiar package of crops, livestock, and farming villages appeared. The people archaeologists call the Natufians occupied a threshold between older patterns of movement and a newer relationship with place. Their story stretches from roughly 15,000 to 11,500 years before the present, during a period when the landscape offered unusual opportunities to those willing to linger. The Natufians were not city builders, nor were they farmers in the later Neolithic sense. Their lives still included hunting, gathering, and the use of wild resources. Yet something about their settlements appears different from many earlier communities. Archaeological evidence suggests that some groups remained in particular locations for longer periods, returning repeatedly, or living there for substantial portions of the year. For this reason, they are often described as sedentary or semi sedentary before agriculture fully emerged. That phrase can sound more dramatic than it was. Semi sedentary did not mean streets, markets, or permanent urban neighborhoods. It described a way of life that occupied a middle ground. People had not abandoned movement altogether, but neither were they following the older rhythm of constant relocation across large territories. Certain places began holding them for longer stretches of time. Part of the reason lay in the richness of the environment itself. Wild cereal stands could provide concentrated plant foods in favorable seasons. Gazelles moved across the region in significant numbers. Other animals, edible plants, and local resources created pockets of abundance that rewarded familiarity with a particular landscape. Stone tools made processing food more efficient, allowing gathered resources to contribute more substantially to daily life. In some locations, more durable structures appeared, suggesting a growing investment in specific sites. Over time, practical habits may have produced deeper changes. A place visited repeatedly becomes easier to know. Paths become familiar. Useful resources become mapped in memory. Seasonal returns stop feeling accidental and begin feeling expected. The landscape gathers associations, not only with food and shelter, but with shared experiences, births, deaths, and gatherings. Without formal ownership, a subtle form of attachment can still emerge. A clearing, a hillside, or a cluster of structures may begin to feel connected to the people who return there again and again. The relationship remains unwritten, yet it grows stronger through repetition. What begins as preference gradually resembles a claim, even if no boundary has been marked and no property has been declared. This shift carried consequences that were easy to overlook at first. Remaining longer in one location encouraged greater investment in resources that could be kept for later use. Food saved for the future offered security during leaner periods. A reserve could bridge the distance between seasons and soften the uncertainty of changing conditions. Yet stored resources introduced vulnerabilities unknown to a more mobile life. What was saved could spoil. What was protected could be lost. Animals, insects, weather, and other people could threaten what had been carefully accumulated. The future was no longer only anticipated. Increasingly, it was being set aside, watched over, and preserved. In that quiet act of keeping something for tomorrow, a new chapter of human life was beginning. The first real revolution may not have been the field, it may have been the storage pit. Time itself began to behave differently when food could wait. For most of human history, nourishment existed within a narrow window. Plants ripened, animals were caught, meals were prepared, and resources were consumed. The rhythm was immediate. Survival depended largely on what could be found, gathered, hunted, or processed in the present. Yet, as some communities spent longer periods in favored locations, a remarkable possibility emerged. Food no longer had to disappear as soon as it was acquired. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Dra in Jordan has contributed to discussions about food storage and pre domestication granaries during the early Neolithic transition. These structures appear before the full agricultural systems that would later transform entire regions. Their significance extends beyond architecture. They reveal a changing relationship with time itself. A stored supply carried part of one season into another. Abundance could be preserved and transported forward through months of uncertainty. The rewards of a productive period no longer vanished with the last meal. Resources could remain available long after the plants had stopped growing or the seasonal opportunities had passed. For perhaps the first time on a substantial scale, people could make decisions that directly shape conditions far beyond the immediate present. This altered daily life in subtle but profound ways. Settlements could remain occupied for longer stretches because food reserves reduced pressure to move constantly. Households could grow larger when resources were available beyond the moment of collection. Planning became more meaningful because future needs could be addressed before they arrived. Communities gained new flexibility in responding to temporary shortages, difficult weather, or fluctuations in local resources. Stored food also supported forms of cooperation that became easier to sustain over time. Sharing could occur across longer intervals. Gatherings could draw upon reserves accumulated earlier in the year. Seasonal events no longer depended entirely on what happened to be available on a particular day. Food acquired in one moment could influence relationships many months later, yet every advantage carried new vulnerabilities. A cache of grain or other preserved resources attracted competitors. Rodents could chew through carefully prepared stores. Insects could spread unseen through accumulated food. Moisture encouraged mold. Fire threatened years of labor in a single destructive event. What had been saved for security could disappear through forces both natural and human. The presence of stored resources also introduced social tensions that mobility often avoided. Valuable supplies required oversight. Decisions had to be made about access, distribution, and responsibility. A reserve could unite a group through mutual support, but it could also become something controlled, protected, or contested. The future now existed in physical form, stacked, hidden, guarded, and counted. A person who carried little could often leave when conditions deteriorated. Movement remained an available solution. A community invested in stored resources faced a different reality. Leaving behind accumulated food meant abandoning effort, planning, and security. The more valuable the reserve became, the stronger the attachment to the place that contained it. Within that quiet transformation, human life crossed another threshold. Food was no longer only nourishment, it became a bridge between seasons, a promise made to the future, and an asset worth protecting. Once a group possessed resources that could be defended, decisions about those resources became increasingly important. On a hilltop in southeastern Anatolia, great stones rose into the sky thousands of years before the appearance of cities, written records, royal dynasties, or imperial governments. Their presence still feels unexpected. They stand in a period often imagined as simple and small, yet the site itself suggests a level of organization that does not fit comfortably inside that image. Göbekli Tepe dates largely to the 10th and ninth millennia before the Common Era. At that time, the familiar structures of later civilization had not yet emerged. There were no urban centers directing labor across vast territories, no scribes recorded transactions, no kings issued commands from palaces. Yet people gathered here and invested extraordinary effort into reshaping the landscape. The earliest phases include monumental circular and oval buildings built from carefully worked stone. Massive pillars occupy the interiors, some reaching heights that required planning, cooperation, and technical skill to erect. Many of these pillars carry carvings of animals and symbolic imagery. Later phases introduced smaller rectangular structures, reflecting changes in how the site developed through time. Archaeological evidence has also linked the area to cereal processing activities, suggesting that food preparation played a role within the broader life of the community. What makes Göbekli Tepe so significant is not simply its age, it is the way it complicates older stories about human development. A common narrative imagines a neat sequence. Farming creates food surpluses. Surpluses create villages. Villages create organized religion and monuments. Göbekli Tepe does not fit comfortably into that latter. The chronology appears more tangled, more human, and perhaps more interesting. The site is often discussed as one of the most important monumental ritual landscapes ever discovered. Interpretations continue to evolve, and certainty remains elusive. Rather than providing simple answers, the stones encourage caution. Their exact meanings are still debated, and many aspects of the site remain open to investigation. Yet even within those uncertainties, one conclusion emerges clearly. People were capable of large-scale collective effort long before the institutions commonly associated with civilization. Labor had to be coordinated, stone had to be quarried, shaped, transported, and arranged. Knowledge had to be shared across many individuals. None of this required a city skyline or a bureaucracy. Human cooperation was already capable of producing places whose purpose extended beyond immediate survival. That possibility changes the texture of the story. Shelter alone does not explain these constructions. Food alone does not explain them either. The site suggests that symbols, gatherings, traditions, and shared experiences could motivate people to work together on projects larger than any household. Animals carved into stone, carefully arranged spaces, and repeated acts of construction hint at communities investing energy into meaning itself. In this sense, Göbekli Tepe offers a glimpse of a species already skilled at creating social worlds. Long before formal governments appeared, people could assemble around common ideas and transform those ideas into physical reality. The stones remain where they were placed, silent evidence that collective imagination was becoming a force capable of reshaping the human landscape. Layer by layer, generation by generation, a mound began to rise from the Anatolian plain. It was not built as a monument in the usual sense. No single ruler ordered its construction. No master plan stretched across centuries. Instead, the mound grew through repetition. Houses were built, occupied, repaired, abandoned, and built again. Each cycle added another thin layer to the landscape until the accumulated remains of countless lives formed a remarkable record of settled existence. Today, that place is known as Çatalhöyük. The eastern mound preserves 18 levels of Neolithic occupation, dating from approximately 7,400 to 6,200 before the Common Era. Few sites offer such a detailed glimpse into what happened when human beings stopped treating a location as temporary and began treating it as home across many generations. The settlement itself appears strikingly dense. Mud brick houses stood pressed closely against one another, leaving little room between structures. Many reconstructions suggest that movement often occurred across rooftops rather than along streets at ground level. Openings in roofs served as entrances, bringing people down into the spaces where daily life unfolded. From above, the settlement may have resembled a tightly packed patchwork of connected surfaces rather than a collection of separate homes. What makes this arrangement so important is the degree of permanence it represents. Earlier communities had returned repeatedly to favored locations, but here the relationship with place reached a new intensity. People were no longer merely revisiting familiar ground. They were building directly upon the traces of those who had lived there before. Every reconstructed wall and renewed floor connected one household to earlier occupations beneath it. The result was a landscape shaped by accumulated memory. A child growing up in one house might sleep above the remains of earlier generations. Daily activities unfolded within buildings whose histories extended beyond any individual lifetime. The settlement became a physical archive, preserving countless acts of cooking, repairing, crafting, resting, and gathering. Density changed social life as well. Neighbors could not easily disappear beyond the horizon. Human relationships unfolded within close proximity. Sounds traveled through shared spaces. Activities became more visible. Cooperation gained new importance because many people occupied the same built environment. Everyday life increasingly required navigation of social complexity alongside practical survival. The settlement also concentrated challenges: food preparation, tool use, animals, children, smoke, and waste existed within a confined world of interconnected households. Problems that dispersed naturally across larger territories now accumulated within a more permanent setting. Managing those pressures became part of living successfully in a densely occupied community. Death itself remained woven into domestic life. Evidence from Çatalhöyük shows that some burials occurred beneath house floors, bringing memory and ancestry into the heart of everyday spaces. The boundaries between household, history, and identity became increasingly intertwined. Yet this was not a city in the later sense. There were no palaces dominating the skyline, no state bureaucracy, and no imperial administration. Çatalhöyük was a large Neolithic settlement, a place where settled life had become deeply rooted without developing into a formal capital. Within its crowded architecture, another transformation was quietly unfolding. Human bodies, habits, and daily routines were adapting to a world enclosed by walls, neighbors, and permanence. Bones remember what memory forgets. Long after houses collapse and fields vanish beneath soil, the human skeleton continues carrying traces of everyday life. Within ancient bones, archaeologists can sometimes detect echoes of work, diet, illness, growth, and hardship. The transition into farming did not only reshape landscapes and settlements, it left marks on the people themselves. This evidence comes largely from bioarchaeology, the study of human remains within archaeological contexts. Skeletons preserve clues about stature, physical stress, injury, disease, childhood development, and patterns of activity. They do not tell complete stories, but they offer rare glimpses into how changing ways of life affected the human body over generations. One of the most surprising findings is that agriculture did not automatically create healthier populations. The common image of progress often assumes that farming brought immediate physical improvement. Yet, evidence from many regions paints a more complicated picture. Studies of European skeletal samples, for example, have identified changes in body size and indicators of physiological stress associated with the transition to farming and later agricultural intensification. Part of this complexity emerged from diet. Foragers often drew nourishment from a broad range of foods gathered across different environments. Early farming communities, in some regions, became increasingly dependent on a smaller number of staple crops. Cereals could provide reliable calories, but reliance on a limited group of foods sometimes reduced dietary diversity. The result varied from place to place, yet in certain populations, the shift appears linked to nutritional pressures that left detectable traces in human remains. Daily labor changed as well. Cultivating crops required repeated tasks performed season after season. Fields demanded preparation, maintenance, and harvesting. Grain processing often involved long periods of grinding with stone tools. These activities created repetitive motions that could place strain on muscles, joints, and bones. The body adapted to new rhythms of work that differed from those of earlier lifeways. Settlement density introduced additional challenges. Larger permanent communities concentrated people, animals, waste, and resources within smaller areas. Exposure to environmental stressors could increase under such conditions. Childhood growth patterns, visible in some skeletal remains, sometimes suggest periods of physiological strain during development. The village provided stability, but stability came with costs that mobility had occasionally avoided. None of this means farming was universally harmful. The effects varied greatly according to region, climate, crop choices, local ecology, and historical circumstances. Some agricultural communities thrived, others experienced different combinations of benefits and burdens. Human societies remain diverse, and no single pattern explains every transition. Yet, a remarkable paradox emerges from the evidence. Agriculture often succeeded at the level of populations, even when individual bodies sometimes carried new stresses. Farming could support more people across a given landscape. Larger communities became possible. Settlements endured across generations. The system expanded because it worked, even when that success was accompanied by physical compromises for some of the people living within it. The transformation was therefore not a simple movement from hardship into comfort. It was a trade. Certain uncertainties diminished while new pressures appeared. Human bodies adjusted to a world increasingly organized around fields, schedules, labor, and permanence. And the skeleton was not the only witness to this change. Another record survived as well, preserved in enamel, wear patterns, and tiny traces left behind with every meal. Among the most durable witnesses to human history are not walls, tools, or monuments, but teeth. Long after softer tissues vanish and entire settlements fade into the ground, teeth often remain remarkably intact. Their dense structure allows them to survive conditions that destroy many other traces of life. For archaeologists, they function almost like biological archives, preserving evidence of diet, development, health, and daily habits across immense stretches of time. A human tooth begins recording information early. Interruptions during childhood growth can leave subtle marks within enamel. Patterns of wear accumulate gradually through years of chewing. Damage, disease, and nutrition can all leave physical signatures. Even microscopic chemical traces sometimes survive, providing clues about the foods that entered a person's body long ago. In many cases, the mouth preserves details that other parts of the skeleton cannot. As farming spread through different regions, these records began to change. Communities that relied increasingly on cultivated foods often consumed greater amounts of cooked grains and other starch rich resources. Meals became shaped by ingredients, processed, stored, and prepared within settled environments. The shift was not identical everywhere, yet many agricultural populations developed dietary patterns that differed from those of earlier foraging groups. One consequence appears in the study of dental caries, more commonly known as cavities. These form when bacteria living in the mouth feed on sugars and starches left behind after eating. As the bacteria process these substances, they produce acids capable of gradually damaging tooth enamel. Over time, small areas of decay can expand into visible cavities. Research frequently associates higher rates of dental caries with agricultural diets, particularly those containing greater amounts of carbohydrate rich foods. Yet the relationship remains complex. Different crops, preparation methods, environmental conditions, and cultural practices influenced outcomes in different places. Some farming populations experienced substantial dental problems, while others followed patterns that were less severe. The transition was never identical across all communities. Wear patterns tell another part of the story. Early agricultural food preparation often relied heavily on stone grinding tools. Day after day, grain was crushed and processed into flour. During this process, tiny mineral particles from grinding surfaces could become mixed with food. The contamination was usually invisible, yet it accompanied meals throughout life. Over many years, those microscopic fragments acted like an abrasive. Teeth wore down gradually through repeated exposure. Archaeologists can often observe distinctive wear patterns reflecting this long interaction between stone technology and diet. In some individuals, the effects became remarkably pronounced, revealing how deeply food production had entered ordinary routines. The mouth therefore preserves a detailed record of adaptation. It reveals changing menus, altered preparation techniques, new forms of labor, and different relationships with food. Every meal contributed another small entry to that record. Generations living through the Neolithic transformation carried its consequences not only in settlements and fields, but in the surfaces of their own teeth. What emerges is a portrait of change measured through chewing, grinding, swallowing, and repetition. The revolution reached into daily life with extraordinary intimacy. It became part of nourishment itself, reshaping the evidence left behind in every smile and every jaw. Yet the Neolithic transformation did not stop at food. It also brought new companions into the spaces where people slept, worked, and raised families. For countless generations, animals existed on the other side of a divide. They moved through forests, grasslands, wetlands, and mountains according to their own rhythms, while humans watched, tracked, hunted, and learned from them. The relationship was close, but it remained a relationship between separate worlds. Gradually, that boundary began to soften. The transformation did not happen in a single moment. It unfolded through a long sequence of interactions stretching across many generations. People first depended on wild animals as prey. Knowledge of migration routes, breeding cycles, behavior, and habitat already existed in remarkable detail. Over time, some communities began managing certain animal populations more directly. Herds were guided, protected, and influenced. Eventually, breeding itself came under increasing human control. What emerged was something new in human history: animals living not merely near people, but increasingly within human systems. In the Near East, several species became central to this process. Sheep and goats were among the earliest and most important domesticates. Later, cattle and pigs joined them. Each species followed its own path, shaped by biology, environment, and human choices. Yet together they marked a profound shift. Food no longer depended entirely on finding animals in the landscape. Increasingly, animals could be maintained, managed, and reproduced within human communities. Archaeologists identify domestication through patterns preserved in bones and settlements. Age profiles provide important clues. In managed herds, animals are often slaughtered at different ages than those hunted in wild populations. Sex ratios can also reveal human intervention, since herd management may favor keeping certain animals alive longer than others. Body size sometimes changes over generations as selective pressures shift. Butchery marks, settlement evidence, and broader herd management patterns all contribute to the picture. No single clue stands alone. Instead, many small pieces combine to reveal a changing relationship. As domestication deepened, animals acquired new meanings. They remained sources of meat, but they also became living reserves of future food. A herd represented stored value moving across the landscape on four legs. Ownership could be measured through animals. Wealth could be accumulated through breeding success. In later periods, some species would contribute labor, helping humans move materials, cultivate land, and expand production. The transformation extended beyond economics. Animals entered the sensory world of daily life. Their sounds became familiar parts of settlements. Their odors mixed with those of cooking fires, stored food, damp earth, and human activity. Their needs shaped routines. Feeding, guarding, breeding, and caring for animals became recurring elements of ordinary existence. The boundary between human space and animal space grew increasingly porous. An extraordinary reversal had taken place. For most of the human story, people followed herds. Seasonal movements often required adaptation to the behavior of wild animals. Now, in many communities, herds began following people instead. Human decisions increasingly directed where animals lived, moved, and reproduced. This new intimacy brought advantages, stability, and opportunity. Yet closeness carried consequences that were not immediately visible. As animals crossed the boundary into human settlements, unseen companions crossed with them. Organisms that had once remained largely within animal populations now occupied a world where contact with humans became far more frequent. Not every transformation of the Neolithic could be seen with the human eye. As settlements grew denser and daily life became increasingly concentrated within permanent communities, another world was expanding alongside them. It existed in water, soil, waste, animals, insects, and human bodies. Most of its inhabitants were microscopic. Their movements left no footprints, yet they became part of the new environment created by settled life. One important concept in disease ecology is the zoonotic disease, an illness capable of moving between animals and humans. Such exchanges do not require villages to exist, nor did they begin only after domestication. Humans and animals had shared landscapes for countless generations. What changed was the frequency and intensity of contact. As people and domesticated animals occupied the same spaces more consistently, opportunities for biological exchange increased. The village created conditions unlike those of earlier lifeways. More people lived close together. Daily activities occurred within a relatively fixed area rather than being spread across wider territories. Animals remained nearby for longer periods. Their waste accumulated near homes and working spaces. Food storage attracted rodents seeking reliable sources of nourishment. Water could become contaminated more easily when many individuals depended on the same local resources. Smoke from indoor fires lingered within enclosed structures. Parasites encountered repeated opportunities to circulate through the same population. None of this guaranteed widespread illness. Many communities developed practical strategies for managing their surroundings. Environmental conditions varied enormously from place to place. Yet the basic ecology of settlement introduced challenges that mobility often reduced. The difference can be understood through accumulation. A temporary camp leaves, traces behind. When people move on, refuse remains where it was discarded. Local contamination is gradually abandoned. Parasites lose access to hosts once the group departs. The landscape receives time to recover from concentrated use. Permanent settlements operate according to different rules. People continue living where waste is produced. Animals remain nearby. Storage facilities stay occupied. Water sources serve the same population repeatedly. Biological pressures that might once have dispersed now have greater opportunities to persist within a single location. This altered the pathways through which disease could move. The issue was not simply the presence of pathogens, parasites, or harmful organisms. Such life forms had always existed. The crucial change involved connectivity. Settled communities created networks of repeated contact, linking humans, animals, food supplies, water systems, and living spaces in new ways. Organisms capable of exploiting those connections gained opportunities unavailable in more mobile settings. Archaeologists must approach these questions carefully. The origins of many specific diseases remain difficult to reconstruct with certainty, and it would be misleading to assume that later historical illnesses emerged directly from any particular Neolithic settlement. The broader principle is more important. Disease behaves differently when populations become larger, denser, and more permanent. The village therefore represented more than architecture, food production, or storage. It became a new ecological system, inhabited by humans and countless other forms of life. Some were beneficial, others were harmful. All became participants in the increasingly complex environments people were creating. At the same time, these settlements were supporting something remarkable. Food supplies became more dependable, communities endured longer, families expanded, more children survived into adulthood. The same system that created new disease risks was also creating more people, weaving population growth into the fabric of village life. One of the clearest signs that something profound had changed was not found in a house, a field, or a storage structure. It appeared in the simple fact that there were more people. Archaeologists and demographic researchers often refer to this pattern as the Neolithic demographic transition, a major rise in population associated with the shift from foraging to farming. The evidence does not come from a single site or a single region. Instead, it emerges from many lines of investigation, including cemetery records, settlement patterns, and broader archaeological data. Together, these sources suggest that populations in numerous areas began growing in ways that differed from earlier periods. For most of human history, population growth was constrained by the realities of a mobile existence. Families moved across landscapes, carrying children, tools, and resources. The practical demands of movement often influenced family size. Caring for multiple very young children at the same time could present significant challenges when travel remained a regular part of life. Settled communities altered those conditions. A mother living within a permanent or semi-permanent settlement did not always face the same burden of transporting infants over long distances. Homes provided a stable center for daily activities. Children could remain within a familiar environment rather than moving constantly from place to place. This stability changed the practical realities of raising a family. Food systems contributed as well. Stored resources created opportunities for different approaches to feeding young children. Weaning could sometimes occur earlier when suitable foods were available. Agricultural production also offered a more predictable supply of calories in many circumstances, even if that predictability carried its own risks and limitations. Communities capable of producing and storing food could support larger numbers of people within a given area. Children themselves became part of the agricultural system. As they grew, they could contribute to household tasks and seasonal work. Their labor possessed practical value within farming communities. This did not mean childhood disappeared into work, but it did mean that larger families could become increasingly integrated into the economic life of the settlement. The consequences appeared across entire landscapes. Villages expanded, new settlements emerged, areas that once supported smaller populations began sustaining denser communities. The growth was not uniform everywhere, and regional differences remained significant, yet the overall pattern was substantial enough to leave a visible archaeological signature. Population growth, however, carried costs alongside benefits. More people required more food. More food required more cultivated land. Additional fields demanded more effort to clear, maintain, and harvest. As communities expanded, pressure on resources often increased. Success created new obligations. Every gain generated additional demands that had to be met in the following season and the season after that. This produced a powerful feedback loop. Farming supported larger populations, and larger populations strengthened dependence on farming. A community that had grown beyond the carrying capacity of local wild resources could no longer easily return to earlier ways of life. The very success of agriculture helped lock people into the system that had produced that success. Without any deliberate plan, a new form of dependence emerged. Farming created more humans, and more humans made farming increasingly difficult to abandon. The cycle reinforced itself, tightening generation after generation around the settled world that was still taking shape. A doorway can become a corridor without anyone noticing. At first, each step toward settled life offered practical advantages. A cultivated plot produced food where it was needed. Managed animals provided reliability in uncertain seasons. Permanent dwellings offered stability against changing weather and shifting conditions. None of these developments appeared dangerous in isolation. Each solved an immediate challenge. Each made sense within the circumstances that produced it. Yet systems have consequences beyond the reasons they are created. Over time, the growing success of farming communities altered the range of choices available to them. What had begun as a collection of useful practices slowly became a framework that shaped nearly every aspect of daily existence. The trap was simple in principle. Once a community became organized around agriculture, returning completely to a foraging way of life grew increasingly difficult. Not impossible in every circumstance, but far more complicated than it might first appear. Part of the reason was numerical. Larger populations could be supported by farming systems operating across fixed areas. As communities expanded, local wild resources often became insufficient to sustain everyone at earlier levels. A landscape that could support a small mobile group through hunting, fishing, and gathering might struggle to support a much larger settled population using those same methods alone. Agriculture also demanded commitment through time. Fields existed within seasonal cycles that could not be ignored. Preparation, planting, maintenance, and harvest occurred according to environmental rhythms rather than personal preference. Missing key moments could reduce yields dramatically. Once cultivation became central to survival, abandoning those responsibilities carried substantial risks. Seeds created another form of dependence. A portion of each harvest could not simply be consumed. Some had to be preserved for future planting. Food became linked to future production in a continuous chain stretching across years. Breaking that chain meant sacrificing part of the next season before it even arrived. Domesticated animals added further obligations. Herds required attention, protection, breeding management, and care. They represented resources, but also responsibilities. Their well-being became intertwined with human decisions and daily labor. Physical infrastructure reinforced these commitments. Houses demanded maintenance, tools accumulated, storage facilities required protection. Families invested effort into places that grew more valuable with each passing generation. Leaving meant abandoning not only possessions, but also the labor embedded within them. What makes this transformation remarkable is that it was never designed as a trap. No council gathered to decide that future humanity should become dependent on agriculture. No single generation intended to narrow the options available to those who followed. The process emerged because each solution addressed a real problem. Stability encouraged growth. Growth encouraged further investment. Investment increased dependence. Gradually, civilization began to feel less like an invention and more like a path. Every step forward opened opportunities while quietly reducing the practicality of turning back. The narrowing happened slowly enough that it may have felt natural to those living through it. By the time the pattern became visible across entire regions, settled life was no longer merely one option among many. It had become the foundation supporting communities, households, and generations. People were increasingly bound to particular places, and with that attachment came a new reality. Once leaving became difficult, the significance of land itself began to change. A field looks different when it has taken months to create. Before settled life spread across large regions, people often moved through landscapes rather than investing heavily in any single patch of ground. Rivers, forests, coastlines, grasslands, and valleys provided opportunities that changed with season and circumstance. The land was used, known, remembered, and revisited. Yet a profound distinction exists between using a place and claiming it. The difference emerged gradually as human effort became embedded within particular locations. A cultivated field represented work accumulated across time. Trees and brush might be cleared. Soil might be prepared and maintained. Harvests depended on repeated attention. The land no longer functioned merely as an environment. It became something altered by human hands. Other features added to its value. Reliable water sources supported both people and animals. Productive soils increased the likelihood of successful harvests. Grazing areas helped sustain domesticated herds. Houses concentrated family life in a fixed location. Burials connected memory to specific ground. Food reserves tied future security to particular places. The more effort invested in a landscape, the more difficult it became to treat that landscape as interchangeable with another. Boundaries often emerged long before formal property systems. They did not require walls or fences. A stream could separate one area from another. A line of trees might function as a familiar limit. A pathway used for generations could mark a distinction understood by those who lived nearby. A burial site could anchor memory to a location. Even a field known through repeated cultivation might carry significance recognized by an entire community. These boundaries existed partly in the physical world and partly in shared understanding. People remembered where resources were found, where labor had been invested, and where ancestors were connected to the land. The landscape itself became layered with social meaning. As attachment deepened, relationships changed. Inheritance gained importance because places could now retain value beyond a single lifetime. A house, a field, or a productive grazing area could matter not only to those who used it, but also to those who would come after them. Family histories became increasingly tied to specific locations. The presence of valued land also altered how neighboring groups perceived one another. Communities living near useful resources sometimes developed overlapping interests. Access to water, fertile ground, or grazing areas could become significant concerns. Archaeologists occasionally study defensive features, burned occupation layers, and evidence of injuries preserved in human remains when investigating such questions. Yet every case requires careful interpretation. Human interactions were diverse, and simple explanations rarely capture the full complexity of the past. What matters most is the broader transformation. Once people invested substantial labor into particular places, those places became worth protecting. Land was no longer simply where life happened. It became part of what communities possessed, remembered, depended upon, and passed forward. This shift unfolded quietly. No universal moment announced its arrival, yet its consequences would echo through thousands of years of human history. As landscapes acquired value beyond immediate use, new possibilities emerged alongside new tensions. The ability to claim land and resources created conditions in which differences between households could begin accumulating, often so gradually that they were barely visible at first. Inequality rarely arrives wearing a crown. In later civilizations, social differences can appear obvious. Palaces rise above ordinary homes. Wealth gathers in visible forms. Written records describe ranks, privileges, and authority. But the earliest hints of inequality were often quieter than that. They emerged gradually, woven into everyday life, long before formal rulers dominated the landscape. Archaeologists searching for these patterns rarely find a single moment when equality ends and hierarchy begins. Instead, they observe small differences accumulating across communities. One household may occupy a larger dwelling than another. One burial may contain objects absent from neighboring graves. Certain families may possess greater access to uncommon materials obtained through exchange networks. Even food can leave traces of uneven distribution within a population. None of these clues alone proves a rigid hierarchy, yet together they suggest that resources were not always shared in identical ways. The significance of these differences lies not only in what people possessed, but in how possessions could endure through time. Farming created new opportunities for accumulation. Grain could be stored beyond the season in which it was harvested. Herds could increase in size through successful breeding. Tools remained useful year after year. Houses stood in place rather than being abandoned after short occupations. Material resources became easier to preserve, expand, and transfer across generations. This process altered the relationship between effort and ownership. A successful harvest could contribute to future prosperity. Productive animals could increase a family's resources over many years. Well-maintained homes could become valuable inheritances. Wealth no longer needed to exist only in immediate consumption. It could persist, accumulate, and sometimes grow. That does not mean earlier foraging societies were perfectly equal. Human communities have always contained differences in influence, skill, experience, and social standing. Many mobile societies displayed forms of leadership, prestige, and unequal access to certain resources. The distinction lies in permanence. Settled surplus allowed some inequalities to remain visible and durable in new ways. A stored resource can outlast the moment that created it. Once that becomes possible, advantages gained in one season may influence opportunities in the next. The effects can compound slowly across years and generations. No dramatic revolution is required. Small differences can become larger simply because they are preserved. The process was not entirely negative. Surplus offered genuine protection. Communities with reserves were often better equipped to endure temporary shortages, environmental fluctuations, or unexpected difficulties. Stored resources could support collective projects, strengthen social networks, and improve resilience. In many circumstances, accumulation contributed directly to stability. Yet the same surplus that protected a community could also create separation within it. Access to resources was not always identical. Some households accumulated more than others. Some possessed advantages that became easier to maintain over time. Gradually, material differences acquired social significance. These changes often unfolded quietly enough that no single generation would have recognized them as the beginning of inequality. They emerged through ordinary decisions repeated across countless households. The household itself was becoming increasingly important, not merely as a shelter, but as the primary unit through which resources, memory, labor, and opportunity were organized. Long before kings appeared, the foundations of social difference were already taking shape behind domestic walls. A house can be much more than a shelter. For much of the human story, dwellings often existed as temporary companions to movement. They provided protection from weather, a place to sleep, a center for daily tasks, and then, eventually, they were left behind. The rhythm of life remained larger than any single structure. In the Neolithic world, however, something changed. The house began to gather more pieces of existence beneath one roof. Within permanent homes, activities that had once been distributed across changing landscapes became concentrated in a fixed space. A hearth provided warmth and a place for cooking. Sleeping areas offered continuity from one night to the next. Tools could be stored rather than constantly transported. Food preparation happened in familiar locations, shaped by repetition and routine. Storage spaces protected resources needed weeks or months later. Repairs, craft work, childcare, and countless ordinary tasks unfolded within an environment that remained present year after year. As these activities accumulated, the house became more than a practical structure. It evolved into a world of its own, containing the rhythms, habits, and memories of the people who lived there. Daily life acquired a center that did not move with the seasons. Experiences became attached to rooms, walls, hearths, and floors. Çatalhöyük provides one of the clearest examples of this transformation. Houses there were rebuilt repeatedly across generations. New structures often occupied the same locations as earlier ones, creating continuity that extended far beyond a single lifetime. The interior spaces were not merely functional. Archaeological evidence indicates that some contained symbolic features, decorative elements, and burials integrated into domestic environments. The house became a place where practical life and social meaning existed together. This development altered the relationship between memory and space. Earlier mobile societies certainly possessed deep memories connected to landscapes, routes, gathering places, and seasonal movements. Yet, permanent houses introduced a different form of remembrance. The past could remain physically embedded within the places where people lived each day. Family history became associated with particular walls, floors, and hearths. Memory acquired architecture. The house also changed identity. A fixed dwelling created a stable point around which social life could organize itself. Belonging became increasingly local. People did not simply belong to a wider landscape or seasonal territory. They belonged to a household anchored in a specific place. Relationships between family, home, and location grew stronger with each passing generation. The contrast with earlier shelters is striking. Temporary structures often served immediate needs before being abandoned. A Neolithic house could survive through multiple seasons. It could outlast childhood. It could remain meaningful after the people who built it were gone. Its persistence gave continuity to lives unfolding within an increasingly settled world. Over time, the house became one of humanity's most important inventions, not because of its walls alone, but because of everything those walls contained. Labor, memory, food, identity, relationships, and routine all gathered inside. A structure that once provided protection from the elements gradually became the center of social existence. And in some communities, that center extended even further. The connection between household and memory became so deep that death itself did not always carry people away from home. Beneath some Neolithic floors, the past was not buried far away. In several settled communities, death did not always remove a person from the spaces of ordinary life. Instead, the dead could remain close to hearths, sleeping areas, stored food, and daily movement. Archaeologists have found evidence that some people were buried beneath house floors or near domestic spaces, creating an intimate connection between household life and human remains. This practice did not appear everywhere, and it did not mean the same thing in every place. The Neolithic world was diverse, shaped by local traditions, environments, and histories. Still, where such burials occur, they suggest that houses could hold more than living bodies. They could preserve relationships that continued after death, binding memory to architecture and identity to ground. A burial beneath a floor changes the meaning of a house. The structure is no longer only a place of shelter, work, rest, and storage. It becomes a place where generations overlap. A child might grow above someone remembered by the household. A hearth might burn near the remains of an ancestor or relative. Daily life could unfold above a quieter layer of belonging. The meanings behind these practices must be approached carefully. Archaeologists cannot simply read belief from soil and bone, yet certain possibilities rise gently from the evidence. Burials near domestic spaces may have helped connect families to specific houses. They may have strengthened claims to place through ancestry. They may have preserved household identity across generations, allowing the living to remain connected with those who came before. In this way, memory became local in an especially powerful sense. It was not only carried in stories or gestures, it was held beneath feet, inside walls, under floors, and within the physical fabric of home. The house became a keeper of continuity. It linked the living, the dead, and the future members of the household who would inherit the same space. Some Near Eastern Neolithic sites also preserve striking skull practices. In certain cases, skulls were separated, treated, and sometimes covered with plaster to recreate facial features. These remains have often been discussed in relation to ancestor memory, although interpretations vary. They may have reflected household ties, ritual attention, social identity, or forms of remembrance that cannot be reduced to a single meaning. What matters is the care invested in them. These were not random objects, they were human remains, altered and preserved through deliberate action. Their presence suggests that memory could become something visible, handled, displayed, hidden, or revisited. The dead were not simply gone. In some communities, they remained part of the social world in transformed ways. This deepens the story of settled life. A house was not only a container for possessions, it could become a place where life, death, ancestry, labor, and belonging occupied the same ground. Once memory lived inside houses, meaning began to spread across the surfaces of the Neolithic world. A mark on a wall can survive longer than the hand that made it. As Neolithic communities became more settled, traces of meaning began appearing across the material world with increasing frequency. They emerged in carved stone, painted surfaces, shaped clay, polished ornaments, and carefully arranged objects. These creations were not necessary for producing food, building houses, or storing resources. Yet people invested time, skill, and attention in making them. Something beyond practical survival was being woven into everyday life. The symbolic world of the Neolithic was remarkably diverse. Archaeologists have uncovered figurines shaped by human hands, wall paintings preserved within ancient structures, animal imagery repeated across different contexts, carved pillars bearing deliberate designs, decorated pottery, beads fashioned from valued materials, and ornaments worn on the body. These objects varied enormously across regions and cultures, yet together they reveal communities, expressing ideas through symbols rather than words alone. Çatalhöyük offers one of the richest examples. The settlement contains abundant artistic and symbolic evidence, including repeated animal imagery incorporated into domestic spaces. Certain buildings appear to have received particular decorative attention. Horns, painted motifs, and carefully arranged features transformed ordinary interiors into places carrying layers of meaning beyond their immediate practical function. The challenge is that symbols rarely explain themselves. A carved animal does not arrive with an accompanying text describing its significance. A painted design offers no certainty about the intentions behind it. Archaeologists, therefore, approach interpretation with caution. Many symbols remain debated, and different explanations can often fit the same evidence. The Neolithic world did not leave behind a single unified story that modern researchers can simply read. Yet even when specific meanings remain uncertain, the social role of symbols becomes easier to recognize. Symbols help create belonging. They provide visual reminders that individuals participate in something larger than themselves. A repeated image, ornament, or decorative style can connect people who share a household, a settlement, or a broader cultural tradition. Symbols also carry memory. They preserve ideas beyond the moment in which they are created. A design painted on a wall may remain visible long after the event that inspired it. A bead passed from one person to another can carry associations that outlast individual lives. Meaning becomes portable and durable. Places gain significance through symbols as well. A building becomes more than architecture when decorated with imagery recognized by the community. A gathering space becomes more than an open area when it contains objects associated with shared traditions. Symbols transform physical locations into social landscapes filled with remembered connections. Perhaps most importantly, symbols help cooperation extend beyond immediate family ties. Large communities require ways of expressing shared identity among people who are not closely related. Common imagery, ornaments, and traditions create connections that support trust, participation, and collective activity. They provide a language of belonging that can exist even without writing. By the Neolithic period, humans were increasingly living within worlds shaped by memory, ancestry, architecture, and symbolism. These invisible bonds helped hold communities together across generations. Yet symbols alone could not sustain social life. Shared meaning connected people emotionally and culturally, but another force gathered them together in physical space with equal power. Food did that work. A meal can feed a body, but a feast can shape a community. Long before written laws, formal governments, or organized states appeared, people were already gathering around shared food. These gatherings served practical purposes, yet they also accomplished something less visible. They created relationships, they strengthened connections, they transformed nourishment into a social force capable of influencing how groups cooperated and remembered important moments. Feasts differ from ordinary meals in both scale and purpose. They bring larger numbers of people together at the same time. Food is prepared in quantities that exceed immediate household needs. The event itself becomes significant. Such gatherings may mark seasonal transitions, communal activities, important occasions, or ritual observances. Whatever the specific reason, the shared meal creates an experience that individuals participate in collectively rather than privately. In Neolithic societies, these occasions likely played an important role in maintaining social bonds. A gathering built around food encourages conversation, exchange, cooperation, and recognition. People who share resources often strengthen relationships through the act itself. The meal becomes more than nutrition. It becomes a social event that reinforces belonging. Generosity occupies a central place within this process. Providing food for others demonstrates capability, planning, and commitment to the group. The gesture may create gratitude, strengthen alliances, or encourage future cooperation. In this way, food acquires social value beyond its calories. It begins to function as a medium through which relationships are created and maintained. Evidence connected to Göbekli Tepe has been discussed in relation to large-scale cereal processing, suggesting that substantial quantities of food may have been prepared in association with gatherings at the site. While interpretations remain cautious, such evidence invites consideration of how communal events may have contributed to the social dynamics surrounding early monumental landscapes. The specific foods served at Neolithic feasts undoubtedly varied across regions and periods. Grain-based dishes are plausible in many contexts where cereal processing played an important role. Wild game may have contributed meat in some gatherings. Early domestic animals may have appeared depending on local traditions and chronology. Plant foods collected or cultivated in large quantities could also support communal meals. The exact menus often remain beyond recovery, but the broader pattern of collective consumption is easier to recognize. What makes feasting especially important is its relationship to influence. Organizing a large gathering requires resources, coordination, and planning. Someone must acquire food, prepare it, distribute it, and bring people together. The ability to organize food often becomes the ability to organize people. This does not necessarily imply domination or formal authority. Influence can emerge through generosity as easily as through command. Individuals or households capable of hosting successful gatherings may strengthen their social standing simply because others recognize their role in creating valuable communal experiences. Food becomes a means of shaping relationships, obligations, and networks of cooperation. Within settled communities, these repeated gatherings helped knit larger groups together. Shared meals reinforced the social connections that allowed villages and increasingly complex societies to function. Symbols and traditions provided meaning, but food provided a physical reason for people to assemble in the same place. As gatherings became more regular and communities grew more interconnected, another transformation followed naturally. Supporting settled life required an expanding material world of tools, containers, and durable objects designed to remain where people lived. Some of the most important clues to the agricultural village development do not come from monuments, burials, or settlements. They come from objects left behind in daily life, worn by hands, chipped by work, and abandoned when generations moved on. These ordinary things reveal a profound transformation. They show that people were no longer organizing life around movement, they were organizing life around staying. Across many Neolithic communities, a recognizable material world began to emerge. Permanent dwellings appeared beside fields and grazing areas. Villages developed with structures intended to last. Domestic livestock lived close to human households. Crop raising became a central part of survival. Alongside these changes came a growing collection of tools designed not for travel, but for repeated use in a fixed place. Grinding stones became especially important. Wild seeds and cultivated grains required processing before they could become food. Day after day, grain was crushed, ground, and prepared on heavy stone surfaces. These tools were effective precisely because they were massive. Their weight helped perform the task, yet that same weight made them difficult to transport over long distances. A grinding stone quietly assumed that its owner expected to return tomorrow. Other tools reflected similar expectations. Sickles helped cut grasses and cereal crops during harvest seasons. Stone blades were often fitted into handles and used repeatedly as fields matured year after year. Axes and adzes shaped wood for houses, storage spaces, fences, and other structures connected to settled life. Mortars and pestles processed foods, pigments, and plant materials. Each object represented another thread tying daily activity to a particular location. Pottery deepened this relationship with place. Clay vessels transformed how communities stored and handled resources. Food could be kept for longer periods. Liquids could be carried, poured, and preserved more efficiently. Cooking techniques expanded as containers allowed ingredients to be heated in new ways. Large vessels stored grain, smaller vessels served meals, and specialized containers supported a widening range of household activities. For archaeologists, pottery provides another gift. Tiny residues sometimes survive on vessel surfaces for thousands of years. Traces of oils, plants, animal products, and other materials can offer glimpses into ancient diets and practices. A broken pot can preserve details of everyday life long after its owners have vanished. The growing presence of such objects signals more than technological change. It reflects a shift in expectation. Portable belongings suit a mobile existence. Heavy belongings belong to people who intend to remain. A large grinding stone, a storage jar, or a carefully built hearth represents an investment in a future attached to a particular place. In that sense, heavy objects become a kind of confession. They reveal confidence that tomorrow will occur here rather than somewhere else. They suggest that returning home has become part of the rhythm of life. As villages accumulated tools, containers, livestock, crops, and permanent structures, another possibility emerged naturally. When people no longer needed to carry everything they owned, they gained the freedom to produce more than they personally required. A village can reach a quiet turning point without anyone noticing it. No monument marks the moment. No ceremony announces the change. It happens gradually, through repetition. One person becomes especially skilled at shaping stone. Another develops a reputation for working clay. A third understands animals better than most. Over time, certain hands begin performing certain tasks more often than others. This was the beginning of specialization, not in the modern sense of fixed professions, but as a slow concentration of knowledge and practice. Earlier communities had always contained talented individuals, yet as settlements grew larger and daily life became more complex, opportunities emerged for some people to spend more time refining particular skills. A toolmaker could learn the subtle behavior of stone, recognizing hidden fractures before a strike was ever made. A potter could understand how different clays responded to heat and moisture. Builders gained experience with walls, roofs, and foundations. Herders observed animal behavior across seasons. Bead makers worked with tiny materials, requiring patience and precision. Textile workers transformed plant fibers or animal products into useful fabrics. Some individuals may also have taken on roles connected to ritual, memory, or community traditions. None of this means people stop doing other forms of work. A person skilled at pottery might still help harvest crops. A herder might also repair buildings. Childcare, food preparation, gathering resources, and seasonal labor remained shared responsibilities throughout much of the Neolithic world. Daily life was flexible, and most households likely balanced many tasks at once. Yet, repeated practice changes outcomes. The more often a person performs a skill, the more refined that skill becomes. Better tools emerge from experienced toolmakers. Better containers emerge from experienced potters. Knowledge accumulates gradually, carried in memory, observation, and habit. The village begins to contain individuals whose expertise benefits everyone around them. As skills deepen, another change follows naturally. Dependence begins to grow. A household no longer needs to produce every object for itself if another household can create that object more effectively. Cooperation expands beyond immediate family needs. Relationships become woven through shared labor, exchanged goods, and trusted expertise. This shift may seem subtle, but it represents a profound transformation in human society. Earlier, mobility encouraged a high degree of self-sufficiency because possessions remained limited and movement remained common. Settled life allowed knowledge, materials, and techniques to accumulate in one place. Communities became networks of complementary abilities rather than collections of largely independent households. The result was not weakness, it was interconnection. One family became better at one task, another family excelled at something else, and both benefited through exchange. Social reliance strengthened as self-sufficiency slowly weakened. The success of one household increasingly depended upon the contributions of others. Across the village, skills became resources as valuable as food or land. Knowledge itself began to acquire weight. A carefully crafted tool, a beautifully shaped vessel, or a finely made ornament carried traces of time, practice, and experience. In such a world, useful objects gained lives of their own. Once a community learned to produce something rare, desirable, or unusually effective, that object no longer needed to remain where it was made. It could travel across landscapes, carrying connections farther than the people who created it. Long before coins existed, before written contracts, before marketplaces filled with merchants and prices, objects were already traveling remarkable distances. A polished stone tool might begin its story near a volcanic hillside and end it hundreds of kilometers away. A shell collected beside a distant shore could appear far inland. Across the Neolithic world, materials moved through human hands, linking communities that may never have met face to face. Trade in this period did not require currency. It did not depend upon banks, governments, or formal economies. Exchange could occur through gifts, partnerships, reciprocal obligations, seasonal gatherings, marriages, or repeated contacts maintained across generations. What mattered was not money, but relationships. The materials themselves reveal these connections. Obsidian appears among the most striking examples. Formed from volcanic activity, obsidian is a natural glass with edges so sharp that even today it can be used in specialized cutting tools. To Neolithic communities, it offered an exceptional material for blades and other implements. Just as important, obsidian possesses a quality archaeologists greatly value. Its geological origin can often be identified through scientific analysis. This means a fragment discovered at one settlement can sometimes be traced back to the volcanic region where it originated. The result is a map of ancient movement. Pieces of obsidian found far from their sources demonstrate that people, goods, and connections stretched across surprisingly large areas. The stone itself becomes evidence of journeys now lost to memory. Obsidian was not alone. Shells traveled inland from coasts. Flint moved between regions where high quality stone was available and places where it was scarce. Pigments crossed landscapes, carrying colors used in decoration, art, and ritual practices. Stone axes appeared in areas far removed from the quarries where suitable rock could be obtained. Beads crafted from rare materials passed from community to community, valued not only for appearance but also for the connections they represented. These objects reveal more than simple movement. They suggest ongoing contact. Exchange requires trust, familiarity, and repeated interaction. Even when journeys were separated by months or years, networks could endure through memory and expectation. A path used once might be used again. A partnership established between groups could continue across generations. Ideas traveled alongside materials. A decorative style seen in one region might appear elsewhere. Techniques for shaping stone, crafting ornaments, or organizing daily life could spread through the same routes that carried physical objects. Trade became a channel through which knowledge moved quietly across the landscape. The Neolithic world was therefore far less isolated than it might appear. Villages were rooted in particular places, yet they remained connected by invisible threads stretching across hills, rivers, plains, and coastlines. These were routes of movement, but also routes of memory. People remembered where valuable materials originated and who could provide access to them. Seen from above, the landscape was becoming a web of relationships. Goods traveled between communities, carrying stories, techniques, and expectations along with them. As these networks expanded and strengthened, something even more transformative began to move through them. Farming itself started following the pathways that exchange had already helped create. From a distance, the spread of agriculture can appear deceptively simple. A new way of life emerges in one region, then gradually expands outward until it reaches another. On a map, the process can resemble an advancing tide moving across continents. Yet the reality preserved in archaeology, genetics, and ancient landscapes is far more intricate. Farming spread, but it did not spread in only one way. As settled communities grew in parts of Southwest Asia, knowledge connected to crops, animals, and village life began moving beyond its earliest centers. Some of that movement involved people themselves. Families and communities migrated into new regions, bringing seeds, livestock, tools, and traditions with them. Their journeys carried agricultural practices across Anatolia and into southeastern Europe, where new settlements appeared in landscapes previously occupied by populations living different ways of life. But migration was only part of the story. In many places, local groups encountered farming through contact rather than replacement. Ideas can travel faster than populations. A neighboring community might observe a new crop, a different tool, or an unfamiliar method of storing food, and gradually incorporate selected elements into its own routines. Adoption could occur slowly, unevenly, and without abandoning older practices. Intermarriage added another layer to the process. Human communities rarely exist as sealed worlds. Partnerships between groups created opportunities for knowledge, customs, and technologies to move across social boundaries. Children born into these connections inherited multiple traditions, helping blend practices that had once been separate. Exchange networks also played a role. The same pathways that carried valuable materials across landscapes could carry information. A traveler returning from a distant settlement might bring stories of unfamiliar foods or animals. A visiting group might demonstrate a technique that later became locally useful. Through countless small interactions, ideas spread beyond the places where they first developed. The routes through which agriculture expanded were diverse. Some movements followed Mediterranean coastlines, where maritime travel connected distant communities. Others traveled through the Balkans and into southeastern Europe. The Danube corridor became another important pathway, linking regions through river systems that supported movement and communication. Rather than a single road, there were many roads, intersecting and diverging across generations. Ancient DNA studies add further depth to this picture. Research indicates that early European farming populations included major ancestry contributions from Anatolian and Near Eastern related farming groups, although patterns varied significantly from region to region. These findings support the idea that migration contributed substantially to agricultural expansion, while also revealing a complex history of interaction and mixture. What emerges is not a story of instant transformation. Farming did not sweep across Europe and erase hunter gatherer communities overnight. In many places, different lifeways coexisted for centuries. Some groups adopted crops while continuing to hunt and gather extensively. Others maintained older traditions while interacting with neighboring farmers. Mixed economies developed, combining elements from multiple worlds. The Neolithic transition therefore unfolded as a mosaic rather than a uniform march. Adoption, resistance, experimentation, and compromise appeared in different combinations depending on local circumstances. Across vast stretches of land, human communities encountered agriculture and responded in their own ways. Some welcomed aspects of it, some delayed embracing it, and some continued following familiar paths even as the new system appeared on the horizon. Not every community looked at the spread of farming and immediately followed its path. Across vast regions of the Neolithic world, many people continued living in ways that had sustained their ancestors for generations. They were not unaware of agriculture, nor were they necessarily isolated from farming societies. In many cases, they knew such communities existed and interacted with them. Yet they chose different arrangements for daily life. The reason often began with the landscape itself. Some coastlines provided extraordinary abundance. Shellfish, fish, seabirds, and marine mammals could support large populations without the need to cultivate crops. Along major rivers, seasonal migrations of fish created dependable food supplies. Dense forests offered nuts, fruits, game, and plant resources that returned year after year. In these environments, the practical pressure to clear fields and maintain crops could be relatively low. Seasonal abundance mattered greatly. Where nature already provided concentrated resources, the benefits of agriculture were not always obvious. A farming village demanded continuous attention, while a rich estuary or productive woodland could sometimes support communities with greater flexibility. Different landscapes offered different solutions to the challenge of survival. Culture also played a role. Human decisions are never guided solely by calories or efficiency. Traditions, values, knowledge systems, and social identities influence how people respond to new opportunities. A way of life inherited through countless generations carries meaning beyond its economic advantages. Communities often preserve familiar practices because those practices are woven into memory, belonging, and understanding of the world. The contrast between farmers and foragers was also less absolute than it sometimes appears. Many groups adopted selected elements of Neolithic life without embracing the entire package. Pottery provides one example. In some regions, communities produced and used ceramic vessels while continuing to depend heavily on hunting, fishing, and gathering. The technology traveled independently of full agricultural settlement. Other populations combined herding with gathering wild resources. Animals might be managed seasonally, while traditional food sources remained important. Some communities practiced limited cultivation during certain parts of the year, but relied on fishing, hunting, or gathering during others. Mobility and farming could coexist in surprisingly flexible ways. Exchange strengthened these mixed approaches. Mobile groups often maintained relationships with neighboring farmers. Goods, materials, and knowledge moved between them. A community could obtain useful items through contact without fundamentally reorganizing its entire way of life. Agricultural practices became one option among many, rather than an unavoidable destiny. Seen across centuries, the Neolithic transition resembles a mosaic more than a switch. Different lifeways occupied the same landscapes at the same time. Farmers, fishers, herders, gatherers, and mixed communities often lived within reach of one another. Their stories overlapped, diverged, and occasionally merged. For thousands of years, multiple human futures existed side by side. Some families slept beneath permanent roofs near cultivated fields. Others followed seasonal rhythms shaped by rivers, coastlines, forests, or grasslands. Neither path vanished immediately. Both continued to evolve within a changing world. This diversity reveals an important truth. The rise of agriculture was not a single decision made by humanity as a whole. It was a collection of choices, unfolding differently across regions and generations. Yet, wherever farming became deeply rooted, another transformation gradually emerged. The rhythm of life itself began to bend around the demands of time. Long before clocks divided the day into measured units, the sky had already begun assigning tasks. A farmer standing at the edge of a field did not simply watch the passing seasons. The changing year became a set of instructions. Certain actions had to happen before visible rewards appeared. Seeds entered the ground long before grain filled storage vessels. Work moved ahead of certainty. This marked a profound change in humanity's relationship with time. In many foraging societies, people responded to opportunities as they emerged. Ripening fruit, migrating animals, spawning fish, or seasonal plant growth created moments of abundance that could be used when they arrived. The rhythm was often responsive. The landscape revealed what was available, and people adjusted accordingly. Agriculture demanded something different. Preparation became as important as harvest. A missed planting season could not simply be recovered a few days later. Fields operated according to biological schedules beyond human negotiation. Crops germinated, matured, and produced seed according to cycles rooted in climate, sunlight, soil moisture, and temperature. Success increasingly depended upon acting before food existed. The result was a closer attention to recurring patterns. People watched the movement of the sun across the horizon. They observed the changing shape of the moon. They noticed the arrival of seasonal rains, the flowering of familiar plants, the behavior of birds, and the breeding cycles of animals. These observations were practical forms of knowledge built gradually through generations of experience. The landscape became a calendar long before calendars were written down. Animal management reinforced this dependence on timing. Herds followed their own seasonal rhythms. Breeding periods influenced future food supplies. Young animals required care at predictable moments. Grazing opportunities shifted throughout the year. Decisions made in one season often shaped outcomes many months later. Storage added another layer. Harvests could no longer be viewed only as present food. They became future security. Grain stored too carelessly might spoil. Supplies consumed too quickly could disappear before the next harvest arrived. Planning stretched farther into the future than it had before. Communities increasingly lived within chains of decisions linking one season to the next. As settlements grew, time also became a shared responsibility. Planting often required coordinated labor. Harvesting demanded collective effort during narrow windows of opportunity. Buildings needed repair before weather damaged them. Herds had to be moved at appropriate times. Communal meals and seasonal gatherings frequently followed recurring annual rhythms. The calendar was becoming social as well as agricultural. What emerged was not merely a new method of producing food, it was a new discipline of attention. The year acquired structure. Certain months became associated with preparation, others with waiting, others with intense labor, and others with preservation. The future reached backward into the present, shaping choices before necessity was visible. For generations, people had adapted themselves to the opportunities of the world around them. Now, many communities were adapting themselves to schedules created by fields, herds, and stored harvests. The cycle repeated endlessly, season after season, binding labor to expectation. And once humans obeyed the calendar, work became something larger than survival. A field remembers effort long after footsteps disappear. Beneath every harvest lies a chain of ordinary actions, repeated so often that they begin to define the rhythm of existence itself. By the time settled communities had spread across many landscapes, survival was no longer shaped primarily by movement through the world. It was shaped by returning, again and again, to the same tasks. The cycle often began before anything visible emerged from the soil. Ground had to be cleared. Stones were moved. Tough roots were cut away. Earth was loosened and prepared. Seeds were placed carefully into spaces that had been worked by human hands. Then came waiting, but not inactivity. Weeds competed with crops. Water conditions had to be watched. Animals could damage precious growth. Attention remained fixed on places that demanded constant care. When harvest finally arrived, the work did not end. Stalks had to be cut. Grain had to be separated from husks. Harvested food had to be transported, dried, processed, and protected. What appeared to be a single season of abundance rested upon months of preparation and weeks of intense labor concentrated into narrow windows of time. Beyond the fields, Other responsibilities filled each day. Grain was ground into usable food. Tools needed sharpening and repair. Containers required maintenance. Roofs weathered by rain and sunlight demanded regular attention. Storage spaces had to remain secure and dry. Fires needed fuel. Water needed carrying. Every settled household became a center of continuous production. Animals added another layer to the routine. Herds had to be watched, guided, sheltered, and protected. Young animals required care. Grazing opportunities changed with the seasons. What had once been occasional encounters with wild creatures gradually became daily relationships governed by responsibility and repetition. None of these tasks were necessarily grand. Most would leave no monument behind. Yet, civilization depended upon them. A standing building required maintenance. A settled population required food. A stable community required countless acts of ordinary labor performed reliably across months and years. The visible achievements of later societies rested upon foundations built from work that was often repetitive, practical, and uncelebrated. As generations passed, these routines shaped the structure of time itself. Certain periods became associated with planting, others with tending, others with harvesting, repairing, storing, or preparing for the next cycle. Communities moved through recurring patterns that linked households together. Many people were performing related tasks at roughly the same moments, responding to the same seasonal demands. This synchronization mattered. A village was more than a collection of homes standing near one another. It was a network of coordinated effort. Fields were cultivated because many people participated in similar rhythms. Buildings endured because maintenance happened repeatedly. Food remained available because preparation extended far beyond the moment of gathering. The transformation was subtle enough that no single generation could fully see it, yet the change was profound. Human life had become organized around recurring obligations tied to land, animals, storage, and settlement. Day after day, season after season, labor provided the framework, holding the entire system together. By this point, humans had not simply changed where they lived, they had changed what life demanded from them. Even after fields spread across valleys and settlements settled into familiar places, the horizon remained full of things beyond human control. The cultivated world expanded, but it never stood alone. Just beyond the edges of planted ground, another world continued its own rhythms, indifferent to walls, storage pits, and carefully planned harvests. Early farming communities still depended upon that wider landscape. Hunting did not vanish when crops appeared. Wild animals continued to provide meat, hides, bone, antler, and other valuable materials. Rivers supplied fish. Forests offered nuts, fruits, wood, fibers, and medicinal plants. In many regions, gathering remained an important part of daily life long after cultivation had begun. Farming changed the balance of subsistence, but it rarely replaced every older practice at once. The wild also remained a source of uncertainty. Weather could transform a promising season into a disappointing one. Drought could weaken crops. Heavy rain could damage fields. Insects might consume precious plants. Wild animals could raid stored food or trample cultivated ground. Predators still moved through surrounding landscapes. Human communities had become more settled, but they had not escaped the larger ecological systems around them. This continuing relationship appears not only in practical activities, but also in the symbolic record left behind. Across many Neolithic sites, images of animals remained strikingly prominent. Horns appeared in architectural settings. Birds, large mammals, and powerful creatures found places in artistic traditions. Wild forms continued to occupy the imagination, even as daily life became increasingly tied to managed plants and domesticated animals. The persistence of these images suggests an important tension. People invested enormous effort into creating ordered spaces. Fields were organized, houses were maintained, herds were managed, food was stored. Yet the symbolic world repeatedly turned outward toward creatures that existed beyond direct control. The animal remained a powerful presence in thought, memory, and representation. Part of this may reflect practical reality. Communities never became entirely separate from surrounding ecosystems. Wild resources still mattered. Dangerous encounters still occurred. Knowledge of animal behavior remained valuable, but symbolism often reaches beyond immediate utility. The continued appearance of horns, birds, predators, and other creatures hints at an ongoing conversation between two worlds occupying the same landscape. One world was increasingly shaped by human decisions. The other followed older ecological patterns. The boundary between them grew clearer with each generation. Fields had edges, settlements had limits. Paths connected places of habitation. Beyond those spaces stretched forests, grasslands, rivers, mountains, and animal territories that operated according to different rules. Yet civilization did not erase the wild. It defined itself against it. The more effort communities invested in creating order, the more visible the contrast became. A boundary emerged, not always marked by fences or walls, but by habits, expectations, and ways of living. On one side stood cultivated space. On the other stood a living world that remained only partly predictable. For thousands of years, humans crossed that boundary daily. They hunted beyond it, gathered from it, feared parts of it, and filled their art with its creatures. The divide was real, yet never complete. But when a boundary exists long enough, does it change the creature living inside it? Nothing in the archaeological record allows us to hear a Neolithic thought. No preserved field, house, or burial can reveal exactly what an individual felt while watching a harvest ripen or repairing a family home. Yet the traces left behind reveal patterns of behavior, and behavior can illuminate the kinds of attention that daily life demanded. For most of human existence, movement remained one of the most reliable responses to changing circumstances. Groups followed opportunities across landscapes, shaped by season, weather, migration, and resource availability. The Neolithic did not eliminate mobility everywhere, but wherever settlement deepened, a different relationship with the world emerged. Human attention became increasingly anchored to particular places. A field required observation. Seeds placed into the soil created obligations extending far into the future. A person could no longer think only in terms of immediate conditions. The coming harvest depended upon decisions made months earlier. Weather signs mattered. Seasonal timing mattered. The condition of stored food mattered. Daily life became linked to chains of consequences stretching across the year. Animals demanded similar attention. Herds needed supervision, protection, and planning. Breeding cycles influenced future supplies. Grazing opportunities shifted with environmental conditions. Care was no longer focused solely on what existed in the present moment. It increasingly involved managing what might exist later. Houses altered attention as well. A temporary shelter serves immediate needs. A permanent dwelling accumulates history. Repairs preserve earlier labor. Additions reflect changing circumstances. Walls witness births, deaths, meals, conversations, and ordinary routines. Over generations, a structure becomes more than architecture. It becomes a repository of memory fixed to a specific location. This attachment to place appears repeatedly throughout settled communities. Ancestors remained connected to particular homes. Burials linked families to the same ground. Valuable tools stayed where they were stored. Fields acquired histories of use. The landscape itself became layered with remembered events. Identity grew increasingly entangled with locations that could be revisited again and again. Inheritance also emerged as a more persistent concern. Objects, structures, animals, and cultivated land could endure beyond the lives of individual owners. Decisions increasingly affected descendants who would occupy the same places and rely upon the same resources. The future became less abstract and more tangible. These changes brought advantages and constraints. Settlement offered continuity. Familiar surroundings reduced certain uncertainties. Stored resources could provide security during difficult periods. Knowledge accumulated within places occupied for generations. Yet, stability came with obligations. Fields could not be ignored indefinitely. Buildings required maintenance. Herds required care. Stored food required protection. The contrast is not between freedom and imprisonment, nor between progress and decline. Human communities gained some possibilities while surrendering others. Flexibility often decreased as continuity increased. Immediate adaptation sometimes gave way to long-term commitment. Attention narrowed toward specific locations even as societies became more complex. The remarkable aspect of this transformation is that the human body remained fundamentally the same. The same brain that once tracked shifting opportunities across vast landscapes now monitored harvest cycles, household stores, animal management, and ancestral places. The biological foundation endured, but the environment surrounding it changed profoundly. If the body remained ancient, but the world became built, what part of humanity was truly transformed? The question lingers quietly beneath everything that came before. Fields expanded, villages endured, houses accumulated memories, animals lived beside people, calendars shaped work, boundaries divided cultivated spaces from surrounding landscapes. Yet, beneath all of these changes remains a deeper uncertainty about what, exactly, was transformed. Part of the difficulty lies in the word itself. Wildness can mean many things. It can describe a life lived directly within larger ecosystems, where food, movement, and opportunity depend upon changing environmental conditions. It can describe mobility, adaptability, and close familiarity with local plants, animals, weather, and terrain. It can describe a world where possessions remain limited because everything important must travel with the people who own it. For countless generations, humans lived in ways that fit many of these descriptions. Communities followed seasonal abundance. Knowledge accumulated through direct engagement with landscapes. Survival depended upon reading signs carried by rivers, forests, grasslands, coastlines, and migrating animals. Human lives remained woven tightly into ecological patterns that no person controlled. Civilization introduced a different arrangement. Permanent homes anchored people to specific places. Food was increasingly produced rather than simply gathered. Surplus could be stored and protected. Social rules organized behavior within larger communities. Ritual traditions connected memory to particular locations. Landscapes themselves were reshaped through cultivation, construction, and long-term occupation. At first glance, these two worlds can appear to stand in opposition. One seems wild, the other seems civilized. Yet the archaeological record rarely supports such simple divisions. Early farming communities continued hunting, gathering, observing seasonal changes, and responding to environmental uncertainty. Crops failed, weather shifted, animals behaved according to their own instincts. The wider world never disappeared, nor did the human organism become something fundamentally different. The same senses interpreted the environment, the same emotions influenced decisions, the same biological needs shaped behavior. Human beings remained animals, dependent upon food, water, shelter, cooperation, and reproduction. Civilization altered circumstances, but it did not replace biology. Perhaps the deeper transformation occurred elsewhere. Over time, humans began living within systems they had helped create. Fields required maintenance because fields existed. Storage demanded protection because storage existed. Calendars mattered because agricultural commitments stretched across seasons. Houses accumulated significance because generations invested meaning in them. Many of the forces shaping daily life became human made structures layered upon older ecological realities. This creates a striking paradox. Civilization expanded human control over certain aspects of existence while simultaneously increasing dependence upon constructed systems. The more successful those systems became, the more difficult they were to leave behind. People remained biological creatures, yet much of their attention shifted toward maintaining environments built through collective effort. In that sense, the Neolithic may not have removed wildness from humanity at all. Instead, it surrounded human wildness with fields, walls, calendars, animals, symbols, memories, obligations, and expectations. The ancient creature remained present within a newly constructed world. Imagine a village at dawn. Thin smoke rises into cool morning air. Grain waits inside a carefully maintained house. Footpaths connect neighboring homes. Beyond the cultivated ground, the wider landscape stretches outward beneath the same sky that guided countless generations before settlement. The open land is still there, waiting beyond the fields. Sometimes the largest transformations arrive so gradually that no single generation can see their full shape. A field cleared beside a river, a house rebuilt upon the remains of an older house, a store of grain protected through winter, a child growing up in a place their grandparents once knew as open ground. Each change appears small when viewed alone. Yet over centuries, these quiet decisions accumulated into something far greater than any individual could have intended. The Neolithic was not simply the age of farming. It was not merely the age of polished stone tools, domesticated animals, pottery, or permanent villages. Those were visible expressions of a deeper process. Beneath them lay a new relationship between humans and the future itself. People began creating systems designed to endure beyond a season, beyond a harvest, and beyond a single lifetime. As the long story unfolded, one change led gently into another. Staying in one place made storage matter. Storage made planning matter. Planning made fields matter. Fields encouraged population growth. Growing populations made coordination matter. Coordination encouraged rules, expectations, and shared responsibilities. Over time, those systems became the foundations upon which later civilizations would stand. None of this appeared as a sudden invention. There was no single morning when humanity crossed a visible line separating one world from another. The transformation spread unevenly across landscapes and generations. Some communities embraced farming quickly. Others adopted parts of it while maintaining older traditions. Some continued gathering, fishing, herding, and cultivating in combinations that blurred any simple distinction. The change was real, but it unfolded through countless local stories, rather than one universal moment. Looking back through archaeology, The dawn of civilization resembles less a clean sunrise and more a slow brightening. Light gathers gradually across hearths where meals were prepared, across graves where memory remained connected to place, across fields shaped by repeated labor, across animals living beside human households, across houses carrying the traces of generations who repaired walls, stored food, raised children, and remembered those who came before them. Perhaps that is why the Neolithic remains so important. The systems first assembled during this era never truly disappeared. Cities, nations, economies, property, inheritance, calendars, institutions, and long-term planning all emerged from pathways that began during those distant millennia. The details changed, the scale expanded, yet the underlying logic remained remarkably familiar. Humans did not stop being wild because they stopped being animals. They stopped being wild, at least in one sense, because they increasingly lived inside worlds they had made themselves. The field, the house, the boundary, the storehouse, the calendar, and the village became environments as influential as forests, rivers, and migrating herds had once been. And now, as this long journey reaches its resting place, I would love to hear what part of the Neolithic transformation surprised you most. Share where you are watching from and what time it is where you are. If you enjoy these calm explorations of the hidden turning points that shaped our world, consider subscribing for more stories that uncover the deep history still living quietly around us.